Deformities in leprosy. Welcome, residents and colleagues, to this Masterclass explainer. Let's jump right in. Leprosy remains this profoundly debilitating disease, right? And it's not merely because of the cutaneous lesions, but really it's due to these progressive neuropathic disabilities. Today, we're going to totally unpack this. We will comprehensively analyze the immunopathogenesis, the varied clinical manifestations, and the evidence-based medical and surgical management of these deformities. So let's get started. Here is our clinical roadmap for today's grand rounds. We're moving sequentially through 6 key domains. First up, pathogenesis and nerve damage. Then, hand deformities and palsies, followed by foot deformities and neuropathy. Next, we'll hit facial and systemic manifestations, then orthotics and surgical correction, and finally, ulcers and comprehensive rehabilitation. Section 1, pathogenesis and nerve damage. Let's lay the physiological groundwork. Okay, look at this. This brilliantly illustrates the high stakes of untreated leprosy using the WHO conceptual framework. You start with an isolated impairment, like sensory loss from peripheral neuritis. If left unchecked, it progresses to a disability, meaning the patient literally can't carry out daily activities. This disability creates a profound handicap, triggering a debilitation, loosening of social ties, and ultimately total destitution. It's essentially a domino effect. Our absolute goal as clinicians, intercepting this exact cascade through early detection and multi-drug therapy. Now, for your board exams, you absolutely must commit these sequential stages of nerve involvement to memory. Mycobacterium leprae specifically targets Schwann cells. How? By binding to laminin alpha-2 receptors on the basal lamina. This parasitization evokes a really vigorous tissue immune response, which you'll see clinically as a thickened, palpable nerve trunk. But here's the critical clinical pearl. At the stage of functional nerve damage, it is completely reversible if you jump in with prompt systemic steroids and multi-drug therapy. However, once endoneurial collagenization, Wallerian degeneration, and potential caseation occur, that's it. The neural destruction and the subsequent deficit become permanent. Section 2, hand deformities and palsies. Having established the cellular destruction, let's see how this actually manifests biomechanically in the upper extremity. What's really interesting here is how the data elegantly cross-references primary and secondary impairments. This is a super high-yield concept for your viva bulge. Primary specific impairments are caused by direct bacillary infiltration. Think Madarosis on the face, banana fingers, or a swollen reaction foot. Then you have motor paralytic impairments resulting from motor nerve destruction, right? That leads to Lagophthalmos, claw hand, and foot drop. Conversely, secondary anesthetic impairments are exclusively the result of neglected trauma to insensitive zones. This manifests as corneal exposure, digit shortening, and recurrent plantar ulcers. Connecting the neuroanatomy to the clinical deficit is absolutely essential. Take the ulnar nerve. It's most commonly entrapped at the olecranon groove, paralyzing hypothenar muscles and medial limbricals. Clinically, you're going to check for a positive Froment's sign due to adductor pollicis weakness. On the other hand, median nerve damage usually occurs at the wrist, denervating the abductor pollicis brevis and opponens pollicis. What does that give you? The classic simian hand, characterized by severe thenar wasting and the complete inability to oppose the thumb. Note the stark clinical contrast here. First, observe the intrinsic minus hand driven by an isolated low ulnar palsy. With the lumbricals paralyzed, the unopposed long extensors literally pull the metacarpal phalangeal joints into hyperextension, forcing secondary proximal interphalangeal flexion. This entire cascade is correctable if the Bouvier test is positive. But, check this out, in a triple palsy involving the radial nerve, extensor power is lost above the elbow. Because the digital extensors can't hyperextend the metacarpal phalangeal joints, the mechanical claws simply cannot form. You're left with a completely flaccid wrist drop. But it's not all about paralytic changes. We also have to recognize specific tissue-infiltrative deformities that occur during immunological reactions. That swollen, deeply painful reaction hand is driven by acute erythema nodosum leprosum, a type 2 immune complex-mediated reaction causing dense tenosynovitis. Chronically, this inflammation, mixed with repeated microtrauma, leads to severe acroosteolysis. Radiologically, we see concentric bone resorption and pathological fractures that permanently destroy the skeletal architecture of the digits. Section 3, foot deformities and neuropathy. Let's transition down to the lower limb to analyze a different set of biomechanical challenges driven by entrapment neuropathies. Lower limb topography reveals 2 major vulnerability points. First, the posterior tibial nerve is compressed right within the fibroosseous tarsal tunnel, yielding complete plantar anesthesia and secondary claw toes due to the loss of those intrinsic muscles. Proximally, common perineal nerve ischemia at the exposed fibular neck paralyzes the anterior compartment.
This is what precipitates that rigid foot drop and a compensatory high-stepping gait. And man, that exposes the foot to massive shear forces, eventually leading to catastrophic Charcot-neuroarthropathy. This maps the mechanical stress points of the anesthetic foot perfectly. With the paralysis of intrinsic musculature, the transverse and longitudinal arches just collapse. Normal weight-bearing forces are entirely thrown out the window, shifting immense, unrecognized shear stress onto the forefoot. Because of this, up to 90% of neuropathic ulcers develop precisely over the metatarsal heads. It's all driven by repetitive microtrauma to a totally insensitive anhydrotic sole.
Now, before we even think about planning interventions, we have to stage the ulcer. Pathogenically, these arise from external injury, infected fissures, or deep blisters. Staging goes from a threatened ulcer, which presents merely as localized deep tenderness and erythema, to a concealed necrotic blister, and finally an overt open wound. Clinically, we categorize these as acute, chronic, or complicated. And this categorization is a real game changer because a complicated ulcer extending into tendon sheaths, joint capsules, or bone demands immediate surgical intervention to prevent fulminant osteomyelitis. Section 4, Facial and Systemic Manifestations. So the crucial point here is that while limb deformities profoundly affect mobility, facial and systemic infiltrations directly impact a patient's identity and vital functions. Systemic infiltration creates profound physical stigmata. A heavy dermal bacillary load literally destroys hair follicles, causing that classic superciliary Madarosis, and infiltrates the cartilage to produce sagging Buddha ears and leonine fauces. Ocular involvement is also huge. You see pathognomonic iris pearls, which are basically miliary lepramata forming tight packets of bacilli, and upper facial nerve palsy resulting in sight-threatening Lagophthalmos and exposure keratitis. Systemically, Mycobacterium leprae even infiltrates the testes, causing profound atrophy, reduced testosterone, and compensatory gynecomastia. So we really need aggressive, multidisciplinary medical management here. Section 5, Orthotics and Surgical Correction. Once these deformities are established, our strategy has to shift heavily towards secondary prevention and definitive surgical correction.
Biomechanics become our primary conservative tool. The ankle-foot orthosis is an absolutely non-negotiable intervention for managing acute foot drop. By locking the ankle in strict neutral, we prevent the Achilles tendon from developing an irreversible equinus contracture. You have to maintain this orthotic support simultaneously with aggressive systemic corticosteroids therapy. What we're doing is buying time for potential spontaneous nerve recovery over the ensuing 6 to 12 months.
Splinting is truly foundational to rehabilitation, relying on two core modalities. Static splints simply immobilize the joint in a physiological position, providing essential rest during acute neuritic pain or active reversal reactions. Dynamic splints, on the other hand, utilize spring or elastic traction. They essentially substitute for paralyzed muscles, permitting active and passive exercise against resistance to stretch out established soft tissue contractures. This preserves joint suppleness right up until we can do definitive surgical reconstruction. Here you can really visualize the functional difference in clinical application. On one side, resting the extremity in a static volar cock-up splint supports the wrist, preventing secondary overstretching of the paralyzed extensor mass. In stark contrast, a dynamic dorsal outrigger actively rehabilitates the hand. The elastic traction pulls the digits into extension, substituting for that lost radial nerve function while allowing the patient to actively flex against the bands. It's brilliant for maintaining essential articular mobility. All right, for you postgrads getting ready for boards, you absolutely must commit these high-yield surgical tendon transfers to memory. For a mobile claw hand, Zancali's lasso procedure reroutes the flexor digitorum superficialis through the A1 pulley, creating a flexion force at the metacarpophalangeal joint to eliminate clawing. For foot drop, transferring the tibialis posterior tendon through the interosseous membrane to the dorsum of the foot restores active dorsiflexion. And for Lagophthalmos, lateral tarsorrhaphy narrows the palpebral fissure while temporalis muscle transfer actively restores the blink reflex. Know these cold. Section 6, Ulcers and Comprehensive Rehabilitation. For our final module, we focus on the lifelong management of trophic changes and complete re-enablement. Uncomplicated acute plantar ulcers demand absolute offloading, usually via a below-knee plaster of Paris cast. Post-healing, it's all about lifestyle modification. Patients must transition to lifelong customized microcellular rubber footwear. To get optimal pressure redistribution, this MCR needs a specific density, typically a Shore A hardness of exactly 15.
Combine that with daily hydration soaking, scraping of hyperkeratotic calluses, and oil massage, and this strict biomechanical protocol becomes the absolute key to preventing recurrent ulceration and limb amputation. In cases of irreversible gross hand deformity or an ape thumb, we deploy targeted occupational therapy. An opponent's splint forces the thumb into functional opposition, preserving that critical first web space. Alongside that, we use custom epoxy resin grip aids molded directly onto daily utensils and tools. Because the hands are profoundly anesthetic and anhydrotic, these customized grips are absolute lifesavers. They prevent unrecognized thermal burns and friction injuries, vastly improving the patient's quality of life and restoring occupational independence. So, to bring it all together, successful management requires early recognition of nerve damage, aggressive use of systemic steroids, proper splinting, and precise tendon transfers. But I want to leave you with a provocative question. How can we move beyond treating leprosy purely as an infectious disease to embracing complete neurological, surgical, and social re-enablement? Achieving microbiological cure with multi-drug therapy is really only the beginning. Our true mandate as dermatologists isn't just killing the bug, it's actively intervening at every single stage to prevent sensory loss from becoming profound destitution. Re-enablement is the ultimate cure. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.